Thank you, Tom. I don't know if I can go after Anthony's great speech. I agree with everything that he said. He really hit all the major points. I wanted to start with just a few basic points about the region before I talk about every country, about what I saw. I first want to start talking about Hama rules that Thomas Friedman came up with in 1982. Basically says that the dictator can kill and massacre his people in the Middle East, and that's the rules that we play by when Assad killed, President Hafez al-Assad killed about 10 to 15,000 people. That was basically a unique experience in the Middle East. We're talking about Alawis and Sunnis and the historical oppression of the Sunnis and the Alawis oppressing the minority Alawis. No one was really able to replicate that in the Middle East. I'm more apt to agree with the view that sees the Arab leader as a tribal sheikh, as the Islamic historian Yaqubi described the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, where he said he threatens and he promises. He basically cajoles, flatters, and threatens to achieve policy objectives rather than using brute force, and violence is merely only a tool that he uses to achieve broader aims and not the only one. Another broad thing that we're seeing in the Middle East, there was a long debate in Middle East circles about whether the Arabs were like us, whether values were universal or not. The idea was embodied in Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. It now appears that the Arabs love freedom as much as we do, that the differences between the two civilizations is very large. H.A.R. Gibbs' theories about development seem much more apt today. That said, it remains to be seen whether the Arabs will embrace new modern values or remain embedded to their traditional ones, neo-patriarchal ones, as Hisham Sharabi discussed in his book. I want to talk now about the 3 countries I visited in the last month or so, or actually 6 weeks, and then talk about Yemen, a country that I do research about. First off, in Egypt, the revolution took many by storm and shock. A lot of people outside the square couldn't really stand the instability. They kept saying, "This is not Egypt. This is not who we are." They were very frustrated. This was especially true outside the square, where the television cameras were focused on Liberation Square. Many Cairenes outside the square was frustrated with the protesters because it damaged the economy. And Mubarak still had some support in society. There were people that, even to the last days, were still saying, Jamal could be a good president. And this wasn't isolated cases. You were seeing this throughout Cairo. In the early days of the revolution, many in the West spoke of a Muslim Brotherhood takeover and feared an Iranian revolution redux. That was overly exaggerated. The Cairenes that I spoke to fear a religious takeover and the loss of their liberties. Appreciating these concerns, the Muslim Brotherhood decided not to seek absolute power and decided not to run candidates in more than half the districts so that they wouldn't receive an absolute majority. That said, we have seen an upswing in religiosity in Islamic groups. The end of the Mubarak era and its policy of religious containment has led to the emergence of new and old religious groups. Salafists who historically tried to shun politics have publicly emerged, and they took a vocal position during the constitutional referendum, the referendum on amending the Constitution. We've also seen radical groups that engaged in terrorism in the past, such as the Gama al-Islamiyya, declare that they want to transition into political parties. And the notion of, on the subject of Israel, I found out that people still support the peace treaty with Israel, the Camp David Accords. They don't really want war, but they do claim that Israel is violating the treaty and they want Israel to abide by it. Populist politicians who will have low poll numbers will probably seek to exploit the issue and to use it to their advantage in elections. We're already seeing this with people like Ayman Noor. But the military will never allow the civilian government to annul the treaty because it brings in the latest military technology and about $1.3 billion in aid. When we look to the future and the future leader, we only have a few choices. Amr Moussa must be considered the front runner for the presidential elections. He's been in the media spotlight since he became foreign minister in 1991. 10 years later, he was named Secretary General of the Arab League. This means that a generation of Egyptians grew up knowing him on a first-name basis. He won the admiration of his countrymen when he stood up to Israel during the peace process years of 1990s. The Israelis were so frustrated with Amr Moussa that they circulated a government document, I think in about April 1995, that said, quote, "There were ill winds blowing in the Egyptian foreign ministry," unquote. This was much like Dominique Villepin in France leading the French charge against the U.S. invasion in Iraq in 2003, making him very, very popular amongst his countrymen. Finally, Amr Moussa has not been associated with the regime for the last decade, leaving him free of accusations of corruption. Another contender is Ahmed Zouail, an Egyptian chemist who won the Nobel Prize. He's very respected in society, but the fact that he took American citizenship hurts him much more than the fact that he spent time abroad. The West has talked up Mohammed al-Baradei for a year before the revolution, but he's proved completely inept at politics, aloof and far too urbane for the average Egyptian fond of humor. Many Egyptians consider him a foreigner, and for the decades abroad, the time that he spent abroad. His name recognition is exclusively tied to the regime placing him in the spotlight when he was IAEA chief. His potshots at the United States have not won him a lot of support recently. Ayman Noor is the final candidate. He almost has no support in society, and he will not be a factor in presidential elections, although if parliamentary elections could be something else. In Bahrain, I was able to spend some time in Bahrain. The idea of Iranian involvement in Bahrain is completely overblown. The mullahs gave up trying to export the revolution to Bahrain in the early 1980s. The island's Shia view themselves as Arabs, limiting their feelings of kinship to Iran on merely religious factors. Many Shia travel to Iran, but only to study and to visit the religious shrines. They don't really buy into Ayatollah Khomeini's ideology. Excuse me, I'm just going to get my water. During my time in Bahrain, I didn't see any pictures of the Ayatollah Khomeini or Ayatollah Khamenei, or flags of Nasrallah, or pictures of Hezbollah leader Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. But I did see the Bahrainis chanting slogans like, quote, "This nation is not for sale, brothers Sunni and Shia," unquote. The mainstream opposition party, Al-Wafaq, looks to Arab Shia religious leaders known as Marjas rather than Iranian ones. Those who look to Iran for guidance are on the fringes of the political spectrum and do not have much support. The Saudis used events in Bahrain to send a signal to their own population, the Americans and the Iranians. They were not going to allow their clients, the Al Khalifa family in Bahrain, to fall or get damaged. Bahrain has been Saudi Arabia's best friend in the Gulf Cooperation Council and votes Riyadh's line all the time. The Saudi regime has propped up Bahrain for decades with financial support. A challenge to the Al Khalifas could have altered the balance of power within the GCC and tilted in favor of the Qataris. Shi'ite power in Bahrain could have also emboldened Saudi Shia who are just across the causeway in the eastern province. Any weakening of Bahrain's Sunni leadership would have been a victory for Iran in the Saudi-Iranian proxy context that is emerging in the wake of the Arab Spring. Looking forward, the situation in Bahrain has reached depths never before seen during previous unrest in the 1920s, 50s, 70s, and 90s. It'll take a long time to repair the damage. Sunnis are scared to travel to Shia areas. They no longer speak with their Shia friends. Shia people were picked up in the hospitals and taken as interrogation quarters. State television brought on guests that probably questioned the loyalty of the Shia. The main opposition party, Al-Wafaq, has lost a lot of its credibility on the streets. The younger generation will be drawn to fringe parties such as Al-Haq, which advocate no compromise with the regime. Crown Prince Salman, the island's leading voice of reconciliation, is in the same hole with Al-Wafaq and lost most of his influence and credibility. In short, the battle may be over in Bahrain, but the hostility will endure. Though the regime is pro-United States and Washington did not back the protesters, the Shia are not anti-U.S. They have conflicting feelings and really don't understand why the United States didn't back their stand. But there's little chance that they will attack American interests, as happened during the protests following the Israeli incursion into the West Bank in April 2002. In Yemen, President Ali Abdullah Saleh overplayed his hand when he resorted to violence on March 18th. General Ali Muhsin proved himself to be the true power behind the throne when he defected and essentially signaled the end of the Saleh era. Even members of units run by Saleh's nephews, counterterrorism units, sided with the protesters. At this point, Saleh is being propped up by his money, having lost all his military and tribal backing. Saleh does not understand that the rules of the game have changed. The tactics that he used in the past, negotiating in bad faith and turning the tables against his interlocutors, is over. People are focused on one thing, getting rid of him, and they are adamant that he do so, and they won't leave the streets until he does. As a result, his room to maneuver is quite limited, and the dignified exit he seeks will be refused him. The opposition has been all over the board in this game. They were slow to respond to the initial protests and then moved to embrace them, gaining them some respect. And now they've lost it all by accepting a deal with Saleh, allowing him to remain president until the parliament accepts his resignation. The backroom deal between Yemen's power brokers smacks of everything that the Yemeni protesters wanted to get rid of. Al-Qaeda, Yemen does not interest the United States as much as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula does. And with the Yemeni military focusing its weapons on other military units, AQAP is free to plot attacks, strengthen existing relationships with its hosts, and develop new strongholds. The organization has proved itself very adept, and it doesn't need a large window of opportunity to score. But now that it's offered more than that, they will be able to exploit instability. Time to think and plot will translate into more creative attacks that have become the hallmark of the most lethal al-Qaeda affiliate. Iran emerged as the big winner of the Arab Spring until events heated up in Syria. The fall of President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was a tremendous coup for Tehran. He had a, quote, visceral hatred, unquote, of Iran, according to American diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks. He feared its religious radicalism would spread to Egypt. He loathed the Shia and saw him as a fifth column in the Arab world. When Hezbollah operatives were caught planning in Egypt in 2009, they confirmed his worst fears. Mubarak stood with the United States and Saudi Arabia as pillars to contain Iranian influence. His successor is sure to take a more conciliatory view towards Iran. Any new Egyptian policy towards Iran will be served as progress. Mubarak's fall leaves Saudi Arabia alone as a counterweight to Iran. In Bahrain, there was little the Iranians could do because they didn't have an operational network on the island, and they had few supporters there. Despite the crushing defeat for the Shia there, Iran emerged somewhat victorious, if only because there's so much enmity directed at the Sunni powers among the Shia. In the zero-sum game that characterizes the Middle East, any defeat of pro-American regimes must be viewed as a victory for Iran. I want to finish by talking a little bit about the United States and its role in the protests. I think Tom talked about the Obama administration and its early paralysis. There's this notion in Washington, United States, that America can really influence events on the ground and persuade people to go into the street or not to go into the street. We saw this with the criticism of President Obama in the June 2009 with the Iranian election, the protests and the aftermath of the Iranian elections. We heard it again during the Egyptian protests. I spoke to the protesters in Egypt and in Bahrain, and they're not taking their cues from the White House. They're taking their cues from pent-up anger and frustrations that Anthony spoke about in his speech. And if President Obama tells them to go into the street, they're not going to go into the street. I remember in the years of the Palestinian Intifada, I never heard a Palestinian say he didn't go into the street because President Bush didn't want him to. He went into the street because that's what he felt. So basically the ability of the President or the United States to really influence people to think what they want on the ground is somewhat limited. Just one last point. I'm hearing a lot about that the Israelis are asking the United States not to put pressure on Syria and the Assad regime. I'm not sure where they're getting this information, because the Israelis I spoke to in senior positions are quite happy to see political instability in Syria and some damage to the Assad regime. In Libya, just a few quick points, because I know our other speakers are going to speak a lot about it. What I'm seeing on the ground in Libya is a lot of joy that the Gaddafi era is over. People have a lot of faith in the National Transitional Council and the politicians there. But if the council is not able to make progress on the battlefront and address burgeoning economic concerns that will arise in the next few months, people are sure to become frustrated and turn on it. So it's in America and the West's interest to really help the council at this point in time. People are pretty frustrated with NATO. They don't understand why NATO can't strike all the time. They're always asking us about this, the foreigners. And they're also very frustrated that all they hear that coming out of America is, well, are these people Al-Qaeda or not? They always tell Obama there's no Al-Qaeda in Libya. They just want their freedom. And it's basically what you see is the fighters there are they're just average people, plumbers, teachers, petrochemical engineers, who go into the front and just want to fight their freedom. This idea that Al-Qaeda is in Libya is very difficult to prove, and we're not really seeing that a lot on the front. With that, I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to get a first